Thank you, Skip, for the warm introduction, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be back home in Little Rock. I look around this room and I see friends from my years working at the Arkansas Gazette. Just a few blocks, the Arkansas Gazette building, as you know, is a few blocks from here. This was an absolutely terrifying neighborhood in those days. Now, the only terror I feel as I look around the room is that I see a selection, actually a collection of all of my former editors are here in the room. And just an addendum to Skip's warm introduction, I actually started my newspaper career here in Arkansas, but not at the Gazette, at the Pine Bluff Commercial down the road. Paul Greenberg was the editorial page editor when I started that, and Ray White, who's sitting over here, was my city editor. And if I can tell just one story about Pine Bluff, I'd like to do that in part because it's a cautionary story for those of you in this room who are students at this beautiful school who may have come from elsewhere, as I did, a Yankee who grew up in upstate New York and went to Oberlin College, and the first trip to the South was coming to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And I was warmly welcomed, as I know all of you have been. This is absolutely my favorite place to have been as a reporter. My first day on the job, though, I was lucky enough to get assigned to cover, this is 1974, the Bicentennial Commission of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and I was suggested by Ray White that I look for something bright out of this meeting and maybe we could push the story onto page one. And Ray sent me out to this meeting, and I went there, maybe like some of you who aren't from Arkansas. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. And there was a guy who led the meeting who, at least in my memory, was a little bit difficult to understand. I think he was, but anyway, I listened carefully and took notes, and I came back and Ray said, anything interesting happened? And I said, well, the only thing I could find that was odd is that they voted to spend $10,000 on promote attendance at bicentennial events. And Ray said, well, that's weird, and we could use a little bright on page one. And so my first byline, my first story in Arkansas and in professional daily newspapers, page one, we had a story a little bright saying the commission was going to spend $10,000 on flowers to, quote, promote attendance at bicentennial events. And there it was, page one. I had it sitting on my desk, and a few hours after our afternoon paper was published, Ross Hall, who was the chairman of the Bicentennial Commission, and I might add a mountain of a man, came all red-faced into the newsroom and marched over to my desk and said, God darn it, I didn't say flowers. I said flowers. F-L-Y-E-R-S. And Ray said, yeah, we're going to have to run a correction on that. So it was an auspicious beginning for my career and my tenure in Arkansas. But Arkansas, as those of you who are from elsewhere and have landed here, as I did back then, find this a warm and hospitable place. And also for those of you interested in political life and public life, as I know everybody who's in this room is, this is one of the most exciting and interesting places to be a reporter. 1974, the year I arrived, was when a guy named Dale Bumpers was taking on J. William Fulbright for the U.S. Senate race. I was in those days covering train car wrecks in Pine Bluff and the Bicentennial Commission, but my dream was to join others in the state and get out and experience this rich cast of characters that populate the political history of Arkansas. And it was such an amazing experience to be able to go around in those days to the Mount Nebo chicken fry and see the likes of, it wasn't just the Dale Bumpers, but there were these candidates in 1976 and 78 when I had the great opportunity, which I'm still so grateful to have had. I'd go out and see the Jim Guy Tucker and David Pryor and Ray Thornton debating each other at these chicken fry, at these events for the honor of being the senator from Arkansas. In those days, in the 1970s, when I got here, the Mount Nebo Chicken Fry and the Levy Day Rally, these were and lest I forget my friends from Pine Bluff, the Gillette Raccoon Supper, yes. That was something they did award to the new arrivals. You got to cover the raccoon supper. The remarkable thing coming from the north was that Arkansas was in those days basically a one-party state. Winthrop Rockefeller, of course, had been governor, changed the history of Arkansas, and made the Republican Party both visible statewide and changed the course of history. By the time I got here, Rockefeller had gone, and really political events centered around the Democratic primary. Those who were running for Republican nominations were tended to be, well, they had great entertainment value. Let me say that as reporters. There was one character who was running for the Senate, I remember, James J. Kelly, who used to begin his speeches. I don't know, everyone that I heard always began, he was kind of a nervous guy. He would go at one of these rallies, he'd sort through his file cards, and he only had 30 seconds or a minute to speak. I remember then he'd get ready to open his speech, which always opened the same words, and he'd say, "I'm disturbed." Then the timekeeper would say, "Time!" And all this is a very long way of saying Republican politics have changed in Arkansas, as they have more dramatically here than they have in the nation. But I mention this because the experience I had in Arkansas, and that I accumulated in going to Minnesota, which was also a state that, while they did have the general election was more interesting in the 70s there than it was in Arkansas in the 70s. Minnesota was also a state that leaned Democratic, the home of Walter Mondale and Hubert Humphrey, and it's now one that, like Arkansas, is considered in play. It's one where Republicans compete, and there was a poll that my old newspaper took this year, take it every year, but for the first time, more Minnesotans identify themselves as Republicans than Democrats, or DFLers as they talk about it up there. So I mentioned this, my wandering story here is to say that one of the things I observed in my career, both in Arkansas and then coming up in Minnesota and then covering national politics for the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times, was transformation of states that I thought I knew, even states that were arguably one-party states or nearly so. And the book that I wrote with my colleague Peter Walston is the story of, if you will, the rise of the Republican Party, even in some unlikely areas. I noticed, and it came to me over time, and even over the decades that we're describing, when I was in Minnesota. Not only was Minnesota transformed, but so were the traditionally Democratic-leaning states of Wisconsin and Iowa and the Dakotas. Some of them are real Republican bastions right now. Minnesota, which when I arrived in the state in the late 70s was, although there was both a healthy and a strong Republican tradition in that state, the state's congressional delegation was dominated by Democrats. The governors tended to be Democratic, and both houses of the state legislature were Democratic. Now the legislature is split. The governor's a Republican, the congressional delegation is evenly split. And there are similar statistics which I could supply for the surrounding states, which have similar histories of Iowa, Wisconsin, so on. The same was true when I worked for the Wall Street Journal. I covered the Ohio River Valley states during the 2000 election. And there you saw similar transformations in states that were once leaning Democratic. Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia was a state that was as solidly Democratic really as Arkansas had been, and it is also a state that's been transformed. So the thesis of our book, One Party Country, the title of it refers in part to this transformation, to Republicanization, a transformation. The one party country idea is really something of a dream. You mentioned Karl Rove earlier. He refers to it as building a durable majority, a durable Republican majority, and it speaks to that dream in part. It's not a suggestion that this is going to be realized or that the Democrats will not compete ever, but it refers to that dream. It also refers to a style of governance my colleague and I observed in Washington covering the 6 years of the Bush administration, in which we argue that this administration won election with a very narrow margin. Some argue it was just the narrow margin of a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court in 2000, and a narrow margin in 2004 also. But the style of governance is to govern as though you have won a landslide, as though you have a mandate, as though in fact you have a one-party country. And my colleague Peter Walson is the lead White House correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. And our book describes some of the ways in which this style of governance presents itself. We both covered the 2004 presidential election campaign, and both reporters who, as you can tell, had been around a bit, covered past presidential campaigns, and we felt that what we were observing was the most sophisticated and well-organized campaign that we had seen from top to bottom. So after the election, we got together, we looked over, and there was one particular story that we did which impressed us greatly, which is one that focused on the White House faith-based initiative and looked particularly at where White House spending had gone to promote the president's faith-based initiative, which, as you all know, is designed to encourage faith-based organizations to move into some of the traditional areas where government agencies had worked to improve drug addiction, prison reentry, and other community services. And what we found was that the money and effort was targeted in laser specificity to battleground states, and we focused specifically on Ohio and some of the Midwestern states that I looked at. We wrote one story about a preacher in Milwaukee who was basically endorsing President Bush from the pulpit and backed Democrats previously. He was even doing mailers around the black precincts of Milwaukee, and what we found was that a few months before he had received a $1.7 million grant from the faith-based initiative for his church. So we wrote about this, and we got a call from a book agent who suggested, is there a book here? And both of us had been thinking about watching this long trend that I described of the Republican advances and having observed this campaign, and we said, yeah, we think so. And in 2005, it really seemed like a good idea, and we adopted this title of book, One Party Country. The president had approval ratings in the high 70s. By the time we finished the book, as you know today, the president's approval rating, of course, had sunk to the basement, one of the quickest drops of presidential approval in history. A major character in our book, Tom DeLay, was under indictment, and Karl Rove, who occupies not only his own chapter but is a consistent figure throughout, was also threatened with indictment, and many pundits thought it was likely. My colleague and I got a little nervous at this point with a book titled One Party Country, and we were called into the office of our bureau chief, Doyle McManus, who showed us to calm down. He's written half a dozen books, and he said, listen, just tweak the introduction, write a new epilogue. Oh, and by the way, I would recommend a new title. I'd call it like Crime of the Century. We stuck with this title in 2006, even though the Democrats feel justifiably a very strong wind at their back. And one of the arguments we'd make is that the Republican advantages that we describe in the book, built over decades and accelerated over the last 6 years under the direction of Karl Rove and Ken Mellman, are providing the Republicans advantages and protections that we witness even in 2006. Such that even in a climate like this, it is far from clear that Democrats will succeed in their goal of retaking one or both houses of Congress. I follow these races very closely, and I'd love to talk to you about some of them if you have questions during the Q&A. It's hard for me, very difficult for me to predict what's going to happen, but one of the lessons of our book is if it comes down to a series of close races, and if the Republican base is not entirely depressed, that the advantage lies with the Republicans in close races. Let me just briefly outline, if I may, the sort of central arguments or the list of our structural and strategic advantages that we outline in the book, and then maybe this will guide questions, and I'm eager to hear from you all and get your ideas and hear what you want to talk about. But let me start with the advantages that we discuss in this book. The first is an advantage in the realm of ideas and the marketing of ideas. And one of the things that we note here is a sort of vigor on the part of conservatives and Republicans throughout, particularly since the defeat of Barry Goldwater in 1964. We chronicle in this book the rise of Republican and conservative thought to a position of dominance in the United States from the ashes of a devastating electoral result in 1964. And conservatives invested strategically in think tanks and in marketing of conservative ideas. And I won't go into detail now, but if you have questions about it, we can come back to it. The second on our list is an advantage in the area of redistricting. And one of the things that was most exciting to me as a reporter was to chronicle or uncover, I didn't know about it before, the efforts of Lee Atwater after Ronald Reagan signed the Voting Rights Act in during his presidency. Lee Atwater and a couple of his agents from the RNC went out and formed common cause in state after state with minority African American and Latino activists to redraw congressional districts in ways that would elect more minorities to Congress, but because of the concentration of minority votes under these minority districts would also yield more Republican seats. And one of the things we argue in the book is that Lee Atwater, who as many of you know, died some years ago of a brain tumor, but his legacy lives on in many ways, and one of them is the redistricting protection which Republicans continue to enjoy. And we argue in the book that that protection endures even if Democrats, as many think they're poised to do in Arkansas and other states, retake control of the state house or state legislatures. The third relates to what I mentioned a moment ago in this outreach to African American ministers, but it's much broader, and we discuss it in the book. It's an extraordinarily, and we argue, effective outreach to minorities, particularly African American and Latinos, but others as well by the Republican Party. This outreach effort has been led, we believe, in many ways, by the Bush family, particularly George Bush and his brother Jeb, who were, not coincidentally, governors in states that had large Latino populations. They absorbed this lesson. Karl Rove was the top aide to George W. Bush, a man who really made his fortune in the direct mail business and knows demographics. They saw the way in which this country was changing, and I think this also coincided with their ideology and their personal beliefs, but they made an extraordinary entrees, particularly into the Latino vote, Latino communities, and African American votes. The fourth advantage, which we also discuss in the book, related also to the example I told you about on the spending of the faith-based money, is a politicization of policy. Now, every administration, of course, is political. We would be naive to think otherwise. It was Harry Hopkins, the aide to Franklin Roosevelt, who famously said, we'll tax and spend and spend and spend and elect, meaning target your spending to those states and those areas that you want to win. Of course this happens. What we argue in the book, and what Peter and I believe we've observed under the Bush administration, is a change in a matter of degree that's quite extraordinary, in which you see the White House intervening and interjecting electoral political considerations into even once independent regulatory and cabinet agencies. And we can come back to those examples too if you like. And there are several other advantages, but I think I'll just close so we can get to questions with one that Skip mentioned a moment ago, which is the area of voter mobilization, getting your supporters to the polls. GOTV, it's sometimes described as we get close to Election Day. This is the area where Democrats reigned supreme in Arkansas and in other states, particularly because the Democrats, much more of a federation of a political party than a sort of top-down political party than Republicans, relied on organized labor to get supporters to the polls. Organized labor through the decades worked the precincts and got voters out, such that all of us remember coming up in politics that if it was a big, heavy turnout, it was considered an advantage for the Democrats. What we learned in 2004, there was a record turnout, particularly in battleground states like Ohio. Democrats actually were quite giddy during the day, on Election Day in 2004, for a variety of reasons, perhaps mostly because of errors in the exit polls, but also because turnout was so heavy. And Democrats did a great job of turning out their voters. But what happened in 2004 is that Republicans outdid them. And Republicans outdid Democrats in getting their in finding supporters and getting them to the polls. And they did it with a combination of a new emphasis on ground troops and using both business and religious organizations to help sort of launch a grassroots effort, combining it with the state-of-the-art technology available in the marketing world. Skip mentioned this micro-targeting a moment ago, in which you use consumer data, personal data, basically everything you can find on an individual, and target a message to that individual. And yes, they do really, the Republicans are paying attention, and the Democrats, struggling to keep up, are starting to as well. If they can find out what booze you prefer or what car you drive, because this helps, it has great predictive value in deciding which messages to send to you. So I think I'll probably maybe wrap up with that list of advantages that we describe in the book, and invite any questions that you all might have.
We'll start questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll pass the mic to you. We'll start over here.
Thank you. Would you talk a little bit more about the politicalization of some of the previously independent government agencies?
Yes. It's almost hard to know where to begin with there, because I think that this is a story that is distinctively associated with this administration. There was, I saw just a reference to a piece that's actually out today, this week in the magazine Nature, which I haven't read, but I cite it to you as an example because there are many others behind it, that look at, that describe scientists in the Commerce Department, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, who are claiming, career employees who are claiming that their efforts to both write and scientifically and distribute reports on global warming were suppressed, and that the suppression was related to the coming election. As you know, that's actually, the story in Nature is just one of a series on this topic, in which government scientists, including those who have been in the ranks of the bureaucracy through Republican and Democratic presidents, are speaking out and saying that they are seeing an intrusion in their work that they haven't seen before. Lest you think that these are only Democrats who are making these claims, there are Republicans who are speaking out, and I'm wondering, I may have to ask for someone's help with the name. I wrote the story at the LA Times. I'm embarrassed I can't recall it, but one of the first administrators under Gerald Ford, I believe, the early administrators of the EPA, it's not Bill Ruckelshaus, but maybe his successor, is among those who have spoken out, saying the Environmental Protection Agency is actually one, this particular director was talking about, is one that was, it was an agency established by Republicans. Republicans have a proud environmental tradition. He maintains contact with agency scientists and says the intrusion of the sort of White House political office into the operations of this independent agency undermine it, and he argues do damage not only to the agency, the work of science, independent work of scientists, but his argument is also to the Republican Party. In the book, we chronicle one of the things that Karl Rove and his first political director in the White House, Ken Mehlman, introduced is a, I think they described it to us as sort of a variation on what had gone before. We think it's extraordinarily different. What it was is a plan to go to every cabinet agency on a regular basis, meaning a few times a year, to deliver basically information from the political office to all of the political appointees of the agencies. Now, if you're a political appointee, you expect to be in touch with what's going on politically, but what Karl Rove and Ken Mehlman would do is go inside an agency. They would take it in the Interior Department, for example. There are about 60 people who are political employees. They're basically the managers of a department. So imagine a room about this size. And they would spend an hour or so, often over a lunch hour, with a series of a PowerPoint presentation telling the political these managers the hot races that are coming up. One of these was in 2002 when Karl Rove was desperate to retake control of the Senate in part because Vermont Senator Jeffords, who had been a Republican, switched to independent, and it gave the Democrats a brief period of majority status in the Senate, at least in voting. And Rove went to the Interior Department, and we had two Interior Department managers. These are Republican political appointees who, by name, decided they wanted to come forward and tell us what the meetings were like. One of the reasons they came forward is that one of the topics Karl Rove mentioned in this particular session was a discussion of the Klamath River in Oregon, which was a stream that's important for salmon spawning in the West, and also it's a river that is traditionally diverted for irrigating farmers' crops. And in 2001, there had been a terrible drought in the West, and there was a dispute, which some of you may remember, between the farmers who needed more water and environmentalists and Indian tribes who were depending on the water to keep the salmon population secure. It's one of these arcane topics that we don't pay a lot of attention to unless you live in Oregon or you're a salmon fisherman. But at the Interior Department, if you're a manager, these are the vital decisions of the day. Interior Department has responsibility for Indian tribes on the one hand. It's got water management issues and wildlife issues to, as political organizations always do, you mediate between these groups. But here comes arguably the most powerful presidential aide in history coming to your agency, doing his PowerPoint presentation. When he gets to Oregon, he says, by the way, we have a vital Senate race here. Gordon Smith was then thought to be in trouble for re-election to the Senate. And Rove mentions, and didn't tell him directly to do, but he said, you know, we need to win these elections, and to win this election, we need to remember our base. The base, farmers, are very important to the success of the Republican Party. Well, within 2 months of Rove's speech at that department, the Secretary of Interior was out in Oregon at a ceremonial moment opening the floodgates of the Klamath River to distribute water to the farmers. Gordon Smith won election. The environmentalists, Indian tribes, and others in the state of Oregon will tell you that the diversion of so much water led to the largest kill of salmon in the history of the western United States. One example of and I've done a very brief summary of it. There are arguments on both sides, but it's an example that we hear from Republicans in government of the intrusion of the executive branch of the White House into once separate and decision-making that was at least relatively immune from politics and completely immune from White House intervention on a regular basis.
Yes. Turn the mic on.
Here you go, that's better. Essentially what's happening is people are being sold candidates. How can we make sure that there's truth in advertising? Truth in advertising? In other words, how can we make sure that the public is getting the true product that is being sold to them as opposed to the image or the idea or the catchwords or the symbols that are being sold to them? Where's the truth? How can we find it?
Yeah, what a great question. You know, there's always been marketing in politics, of course, and the question of separating truth from fiction and political has always been a big test for those of us in my business, political journalists, and also I think for democracy as a whole. And I think it's especially a challenge now. I'm interested in what others think here. As news organizations, major newspapers, regional newspapers in particular, television, local television stations, and national, for whom citizens and voters rely on for political information, invest less in political coverage and dedicate less time to political coverage than they did previously. As news organizations offer less time and less coverage of local political campaigns, it increases the power of those who are doing the messaging, that is, sending the niche messages. And if there's not a debate or discussion in the public arena, I'd argue if there's not, now if someone told me there was some threat even in Arkansas to the continuation of the tradition of the Levy Day rally, I don't know if that's so, but I think that all of these, that public discussion, the public square is very important in sort of airing this sort of thing, and it worries me to see major news organizations and regional news organizations diminishing their coverage, because I think that's the best way to test it. Specifically, some organizations, some news organizations, many have started ad watches, they call it, sort of truth squatting campaigns. It's just that the messaging has become so micro-targeted, if you will, and the channels on which these messages are distributed are so diffuse that it's much harder to keep up with it and do the truth squatting. And at the same time, there is a diminution in both the resources and the space and time dedicated to covering political campaigns. So it's a great question, and it concerns me.
Have fun.
It seems to me that one of the dramatic changes over the last few decades was the Republican Party being seen as the party of religion, and the Democratic Party being the party of anti-religion.
Yes.
Take Ann Coulter's book and things like this. And now when the Democrats are trying to sort of regain
Yes.
sort of a religious stature, it seems rather superficial. I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Yes, well, I think that a big part of the transformation that we've seen has been Republicans, our voting culture has changed some way towards a sort of value-based system of making decisions, no longer economically or interest-based as it had been, I'd argue, at least in the New Deal in the decades that followed it immediately. And there has been a revelation on the part of Democrats, an awakening that the Democratic Party has alienated people of faith, broadly speaking. I went to a presentation, Democrats concerned about this state of affairs. Cornell Belcher, who is the pollster to the DNC and to Howard Dean, offered a presentation from focus groups and small polling he'd done in key districts in Ohio, in rural Ohio. Again, remember, a state that used to be lean Democratic, or at least hold hope for Democrats. And in this rural district, he put up on the screen, numbers that showed that 7 out of 10 people who identified themselves as regular churchgoers said they felt more comfortable with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. And he said flat out to this group of Democratic liberal activists in the room, if we don't turn this around, we are doomed to be a minority party, because this is a nation of religious faith and a nation in which religion plays an enormously powerful role. And if Democrats are seen as a place where religious people are not comfortable, even across the board, where you could get 7 out of 10 registering that kind of concern, it's a very deep problem. It's also an irony and something that Democrats, I think, have been late to wake up to, in part because the Democratic Party once was associated with religion and religious leaders. All of us in this room who recall the civil rights movement in Arkansas and elsewhere know the role that religious groups played in that movement. The Democratic Party was strongly and powerfully associated with that movement, and with other sort of social and political rights movements. But in recent times, it has changed. The change has come concurrently with the rise of these evangelical churches across the country, churches that have been very smart themselves in the realm of marketing and using mass media to get their message out. And these things have built one upon the other exponentially, I'd argue, and created a real problem for the Democrats. There is recognition of it, and there are a couple of groups that have formed in Washington that are seeking to address it. And my sense is that they are having some success. But it's going to take a lot of effort, and there's a ways to go.
Yes.
Could you comment on Senator Danforth's position and criticism to the Republican Party on that point?
Yes. Senator John Danforth, the senator from Missouri, who is also an ordained minister, I believe, has just written a new book, which I hasten to add I have not yet read, though I have read about it, and as I understand, and what I know about it is that he is offering a caution to the Republican Party about using religion and even religious issues to win political campaigns and as a way to divide. He argues that it's not good for the nation and ultimately not good for the Republican Party. He is, I would think, is a powerful and credible voice. I know that he's already come under criticism from some of those on the religious right. There's a Christian values. Anyway, there has been some attacks on Danforth and his new book from the right. I think it's going to open up a very interesting debate in the Republican Party as well, and among religious leaders.
Hey, Tom, in a recent article you wrote, you talked about the sort of the brilliance of Rove's plan and the way this was done, but that there was one possible hiccup that could do that, and you said that was immigration. Could you expand on that and what it does in terms of the proposed Republican majority?
Yes.
That was our last question, too.
That's the last question. Okay, thank you. Well, that's a good one because it is one of the things that we do point to in the book is that while there is a plan which we think is both remarkably ambitious, to date successful, and cohesive, there are actually several fissures that are developing. The one that when we've talked to the thinkers inside the White House, the strategists inside the White House who built a lot of this, the one that makes them the most nervous or that shows up at the top of the list is the immigration debate. In part because, as we discussed earlier, part of the vision of President Bush, Karl Rove, and I guess I would call it that wing or of the White House is to build a broadened Republican Party, one that will appeal to those who embrace conservative and Republican ideology of all races and creeds, and they have made extraordinary inroads and have had success, particularly with Latinos, getting 40 or 44% of the Latino vote in the 2004 election. And this is very much a part of the building block for the future, in part because anyone who is awake, but particularly demographers like Rove, are paying attention to the changing nature of the U.S. population, understand that appealing to this ethnic group is vital, is very important. And what is so worrisome to them is the congressional leadership of Tom Tancredo, the bill that has already passed the House and that has already inflamed the opinions of some Republican Latino leaders who feel concerned that a party that they had chosen to embrace in 2004 may be, in a sense, turning against them. So this immigration debate, which is dividing the nation, is also dividing the Republican Party in significant ways. Now, just the contrary argument is when you talk to Republicans about it, they're worried about the conflict between the Sensenbrenner or Tancredo message in the House, where we build a big, symbolic wall to keep the illegal Mexican immigrants at bay, and the more welcoming position, if you will, of the Bush administration, a comprehensive plan, as they call it. One of the things they argue is that the Republicans now essentially have two positions on immigration. This could be a disadvantage and can bring things down, the coalition down. On the other hand, at least they have two. The Democrats at the moment have none. Anyway, that concludes the questions, I think. So thanks so much.